Yay! Okay, cool. Welcome back. Uh, Waiting for disaster. Ooh, nicely done. I think last year, well, this is on camera, so I won't talk about it. Okay, okay. So again, we've gotten through 3 out of the 5 connectives. We have 2 more to go. I want to talk about the kind of grammar for them to get a grip on them, and then again, we're gonna go from there, finish up the grammar for TFL, talk about the syntax, and be all good. So our 4th connective is the conditional. We talked about this yesterday for quite a bit in the tutorial. But the conditional is the way for us to say if then. Right? So we have in English, if Amanda's in Tilburg, then she's in the Netherlands. We can have T is Amanda's in Tilburg, N is Amanda's in the Netherlands, and then we'll have T conditional N. To put some terminology, again, the bit in the front is the antecedent. It's the trigger condition. And the one at the end is the consequent. It's the consequence. It's the result, the output. Yes? Always. Right? So these are just ways for us to talk about the gaps, right? The antecedent's the one that's always in the front, the consequence just the one in the back. Whatever sentence those happen to be will be different for each conditional. It's a way for us to talk about those. Instead of like, the one on the left or the one on the right, it's just another term. Okay. Now, it's fairly straightforward that if we have a sentence in English of this kind of structure, the ify theny structure, that we're going to symbolize it using the conditional like so. But the conditional is weird. This is going to be the first of many, many times I say that. And one of the first ways we can start to see how the conditional is weird is by thinking about this English sentence. So, Amanda is in Tilburg only if she's in the Netherlands. Now we'll have T be Amanda's in Tilburg and N be Amanda's in the Netherlands. How would we symbolize this English sentence? So I'll go back a slide again. We'll talk about the one before, right? The one before, if, then, and it was like this. So how will we do only if? Yes?
Like this, that way.
It's really tempting. It's really tempting. But actually, no. This one is the exact same. I know that's fucking weird. That feels wrong. And the move that you made is super, super intuitive. It's very appealing. It's very natural. But weirdly, if you have the only if in the middle by itself, it's the same as the if-then structure. Or to give you another way to think about it, if you find only if in the middle by itself, you take the thing before the only as your antecedent. Now this is weird, and I'll try and give you a motivation case for it. Consider this. The match is burning only if there's oxygen in the room. The kind of thing you might read in a math text, or a physics or chemistry textbook. Right? The match is burning only if there's oxygen in the room. Now let's have B be the match is burning, and O be there's oxygen in the room. How would we symbolize this? Well, one way we do it is we could take O as our antecedent and B as our consequent. But this suggests that the presence of oxygen is enough to guarantee the match is burning. And that would be bad because, well, that would mean a hell of a lot of fires all the time. Okay? Matches would just be exploding left and right. That's not what this sentence is saying. This sentence is saying, whenever the match is burning, then there must have been some oxygen there. That is, the presence of oxygen is required for the match to burn. If the match burns, then there's oxygen. So that's why we think only if in this weird backwards way. If you see only if in the middle, you take the thing before the only as your antecedent and the stuff after as your consequent. Again, it's weird. I know it's weird. I know it's weird. But this example, I think, helps make it clear why we do it this way. So we can say then, a sentence can be symbolized as conditional if it can be paraphrased in English as if A then B, or as A only if B. So we saw two structures, if A then B and A only if B. But there's actually a third one that's worth mentioning. What happens if you see A if B? So we know what to do if it's only if in the middle, but what if it's just if? How would we symbolize A if B? This is weird, yeah.
B and then thing today.
Yes. So this can be paraphrased as if B, then A. Willensvee wins if the striker scores. That's another way to say if the striker scores, then Willensvee will win. So again, three different English structures. We have if A then B, A only if B. Both of these get mapped to A conditional B. And then we have a third one, A if B, and that's where we flip it around. So I think this is also, again, kind of coming back to the suggestion. It sounds weird, but this is something we just have to keep practicing. Right. So, okay, yes?
Can we say that B is the antecedent for this?
Yes, yes. So the notion, the terms antecedent and consequent are really just to pick out the gaps, right? So whatever plugs in the front is the antecedent. We don't care what sentence it actually is. And similarly for consequent, right? So in this case, B is the antecedent, A is the consequent. The other way, the other way. All right? No worries. Good. Okay. Again, the conditional is weird. More on the oddities of the conditional next week. Yay! So a few other sentences you've probably come across in philosophy that will all be symbolized with these conditional. And in fact, these are four different ways to all say that, or that would be symbolized as T conditional N. For Amanda to be in Tilburg, it's necessary that she's in the Netherlands. It's a necessary condition on Amanda's being in Tilburg that she be in the Netherlands. Or for Amanda to be in the Netherlands, it's sufficient that she's in Tilburg. Or it's a sufficient condition on Amanda's being in the Netherlands that she's in Tilburg. Lots of different ways to all say the exact same conditional. If she's in Tilburg, then she's in the Netherlands. So have you come across talk of necessary and sufficient conditions? Has this come up yet in any of your other classes? So a necessary condition is something that is required. Being in the Netherlands is a necessary condition for being in Tilburg. That is, if you're in Tilburg, then you're damn well in the Netherlands too. But being in Tilburg, right, is not a necessary condition for being in the Netherlands. Because you could be in Eindhoven, or Breda, or Almere, or God knows why you want to, but Groningen, right? Sorry. Let's all just hope it sinks into the sea. Sorry. Yeah. Shots fired.
Yeah.
So the important thought here is a necessary condition is something that must happen were your first thing to occur. Right? The presence of oxygen is a necessary condition on the match lighting. But the presence of oxygen is not sufficient to make the match light. You need other stuff too. Sufficient brings it about. Necessary is required in order for it to occur. And we can capture that again using these conditionals. We're going to talk more about this going forward, but I want to get this out and mention it now. Okay, so that's the conditional. Now, let's talk about the fun one. The fun one is the biconditional. Here's Bear Pope. So, let's take B as the Pope is a bachelor, and M as the Pope is an unmarried male. Now, how would I symbolize, even this symbolization key, the Pope is a bachelor only if he's an unmarried male? How would we symbolize the Pope's a bachelor only if he's an unmarried male? We talked about only if a second ago. Yeah. So we're going to get to it. We're going to get to it, right? But if it's the only if by itself, right? Remember a second ago, from like 2-3 slides, the only if by itself doesn't use the biconditional.
That's a condition.
Yeah, good. It's a conditional. Which one's going to be our antecedent and which one's our consequent? And Pope as a bachelor is our antecedent, right? So this is going to be B conditional M. Right? Everybody see that? Remember we talked about just a second ago? B conditional M. How about this one? The Pope is a bachelor if he's an unmarried male. Yeah.
The unmarried male antecedent.
The unmarried male, right? M conditional B. Yeah? We see it? Okay. So if it's only if in the middle, we take the thing before the only as our antecedent. If it's the if in the middle, we take the thing after the if as our antecedent. What happens if they're both there? If it's if and only if.
That's biconditional.
Yeah, right? Or to put it another way, it's literally both conditionals. It's a conjunction of the conditional going one way and the conditional going the other way. Again, to go back a slide, we just figured out what to do if it's only if in the middle and if it's if in the middle. So if it says if and only if, it's literally a conjunction of those two sentences. And this is a little bit of a mess, so we save ourselves some time and we introduce the biconditional. Literally just telling us, hey, it's a conditional that goes in both directions. The biconditional just says, hey, you know what's true? A conjunction of two conditionals. Yes?
So if you were to express it in a Venn diagram, there would be the x-axis and the circle.
That is.
So it effectively states for the intensive logic the x-axis.
Yes. Basically, whenever you get one of these, you're always going to get one of those, and vice versa. Nice. Okay, cool, there we go. All 5 connectors. Negation, conjunction, disjunction, conditional, biconditional. That's it. That's all we need. We build everything from there. Yes?
Why is there a sign for the biconditional and not for an exclusive?
Yeah, good. So one of the things that's interesting here is, strictly speaking, we don't need the biconditional, right? We could get by with just this. And part of the explanation here is largely historical accident, but also because this tracks a very particular logical notion we're going to talk about. So this tracks the notion of logical equivalence. That is, whenever one is true, the other is true, and vice versa. And there isn't really a compelling similar thing when it comes to exclusive or. So, just between friends. The conditional is exactly like validity. We even talked about this in the tutorial, I think, yesterday, right? The only time the conditional is false is when the first part's true and the second part's false. When the antecedent's true and the consequence false. That should set off alarm bells because that's the exact same as validity. And when it comes to this, what we're going to say is, right, things are equivalent if whenever one's true, the other, and vice versa, whenever false, vice versa. Yeah.
So we don't necessarily need the biconditional. Is it true that we also don't necessarily need the inclusive order?
Yeah.
Okay. So
In fact-
effectively just be free.
No, in fact, we only need 2.
Oh yes. We don't need to order.
So one of the things that we might talk about, depending on how things go, is a notion of expressive adequacy. So the formal logic that we're developing is, strictly speaking, it has a bunch of unnecessary parts. All you really need is negation and either the disjunction, the conjunction, or the condition. Any one of those pairs is going to be fine. The problem is it becomes very hard to actually use the language. Sentences become awful. So we do stuff like this. Make it easier for us. Human readable. Okay, cool. So we've got all of our parts. Now, let's step away from formal logic for a second and talk about philosophy of language. And I want to ask you a very slightly weird question. But which of these 4 is true and which is false? So Nathan is a philosopher. Nathan is a philosopher. Nathan is composed of 6 letters. And Nathan is composed of 6 letters. What do you think? Is our first one true? Pretty plausible. How about our second one? Interesting. How about our third one? And the fourth one? What's the difference? What's going on? Let's think about just our third and fourth one. Why are we disinclined to say 3 is true, but inclined to say 4 is true? Yeah.
When you are referring to a word or a name, basically, and you put it between the quotation marks, is what it is.
Yeah.
And when you're using the words, then you don't. But you're referring to the word when you're talking about how many letters it is.
Nice, right? So another way to put it, if we're playing this kind of grammar game, I am the subject of the first sentence. Me, this meat bag, right? My name is the subject of the second one. I am the subject of the third one. My name is the subject of the fourth one. To introduce some terminology, we had it a little bit already. When we want to talk about an object, we use the term that it refers to. We want to talk about me, we use my name. When we want to talk about the name, we mention the name. That is, we use a name, we go through the door, and we talk about the referent. When we mention the name, we stop and we talk about the door itself. When we want to talk about the world, we use words. When we want to talk about words, we mention them. This is actually a very deep insight. Going through the language to talk about whatever it's about versus stopping and actually just talking about the language itself. And of course, we have a ready-made tool to indicate when we're mentioning rather than using. What's the tool that we use to indicate mentioning rather than using? Yeah, right? We saw it here. Nathan is the name of Nathan. So in context of things like logic, inverted commas or quotation marks isn't going to indicate indirect speech. So it's not like this, which is, honest to God, my favorite quote ever. Right? Instead, it's telling us that we're talking about the bit of language itself. Right? And this is an incredibly useful tool. It's the kind of thing that actually is, strictly speaking, necessary if we want to do certain bits of philosophy. Here's an easy example. I have a very good friend who works on the semantics of slurs. A big part of their job is talking about slurs. They don't want to use slurs. They don't want to be a bigoted person, but they want to talk about what's going on in the meaning of these terms. So they are very careful to distinguish between use and mention. They want to talk about the language, they don't want to use the language. And a fun little poem that you can think about if you're inclined, play around, think about how many different ways we can make this poem come out true by adding different quotations and things like this. Something fun to play with. So, we have an easy way in English, especially when we're writing English, to indicate a difference between use and mention. I'm kind of generalizing, we can mark a distinction between two different languages. When we're doing things like mentioning, we're talking about a bit of language. And if we wanted to generalize, we could talk about a whole language. And this would be the object language, the one that we are talking about. And then there's the language we're using to do this talking. That will be the meta-language. So for example, this lesson, what have we been doing? We've been talking about TFL. Right? I'm teaching you the grammar of TFL. So it's been our object language. And the meta-language has been English. I've been talking to you in English. It's been slightly augmented English because sometimes I have to say weird things like conditional or negation, which isn't a part of everyday English, but it's still English. Yes?
Just turning talking about the meta language into an object language.
Nice! Right? Weirdly, the last few slides, I've been using English to talk about English. So here's something very cool. Most natural languages are their own meta-language. And in fact, you can have this with certain formal languages too. You just have to be able to talk about your own sentences. TFL obviously isn't going to have this. TFL is extremely restricted. It just does not allow for that sort of stuff. English does. Dutch does. German, French. In fact, I'll take a bet here. Every natural language is going to allow for itself to be its own meta-language. Yes?
Because TFL can't speak about itself.
It cannot talk about itself. Right? It does not have the tools to do that kind of thing. Put another way, in TFL, there is no distinguishing between use and mention. Just doesn't have the tools. TFL only lets you use. So again, this distinction between object language, the one we talk about, and meta language, the one we are using to talk about, is again a very important one. Now, I'm doing all of this for a very weird reason. The tool that we have in English is great. Quotation marks are great. But quotation marks only let you talk about individual expressions. That is, I had Nathan. But if I want to talk about every possible expression, or any arbitrary expression in a language, quotation marks aren't going to do it. Put really bluntly, I could say something like, hey, if A is a sentence of TFL, then negation A is a sentence of TFL. Cool. What about negation B? This just tells me I can use this symbol in this way. What about this symbol? Can I use B in the same way? The quotation marks don't help me there. Put another way, telling you that Nathan is a word in English doesn't tell you whether Amanda is a word in English. You need to be told about each individual word. And that's a real problem if you're trying to state complete grammatical rules. because you want to talk about every possible expression. So we can't use quotation marks if I want to give you the rules, the grammar rules for TFL. So what am I going to do instead? We've actually already seen it. If we think about the definitions we've talked through today, did we notice anything weird about them? And also, I think I did it verbally as we were going through them as well. So maybe we can go back and look at one, and it will help. What's weird here? I mean, there's a bunch of weird things. There's Bear Pope for one. But what's weird in this blue box? Yeah?
The letter.
Yeah, right? I got my sexy swash font going on, right? My sexy swash font A and my sexy swash font B. These are going to be our meta variables. We're going to use typography to help us talk about every possible expression in TFL. This is the way that we're going to symbolize that we're not using A or using B. We're talking about any possible sentence here. I know this feels weird and silly, but it's important because if we just stuck with the quotation marks, we couldn't even express our grammatical rules correctly. Yeah.
So they wanted to show you it works like an X.
It works exactly like that, right? And it's standing in for every possible TFL expression. So our trick is we use different fonts. And this is exactly the same trick that Tim does in the book. So importantly, when we see the sexy swash font, this is not a sentence or an expression in TFL. The sexy swash font is not a TFL sentence. It's not an atomic sentence. It is a way for us to talk about every possible expression in TFL. It's a giant variable. It's a pronoun. It's a pronoun that we can replace with every given TFL expression. So this is a symbol in augmented English used to talk about any TFL expression. It's also, we're going to use it when we get to FOL2, but for now we can just treat it as one for TFL. Again, this is bookkeeping, but it's important bookkeeping. We need to be shallow and pedantic. This is more the pedantic side. Okay, so that was our weird segue through use mention. The important lessons to take forward are going to be getting a grip on the idea of the difference between use mention, this general distinction, and knowing, or at least having in the back of your mind, the difference between a meta language and an object language. Yeah.
If we were to have this like a test, how do we make sure that you can make a distinction between our pace and our fancy?
I mean, so I'm not going to ask you that kind of thing on the test. Generally, I'm not going to be this picky. This is me trying to be as thorough as possible. But if you're really worried about it, I mean, you can always write like slightly fancy. It's hard with a C. I always like, how do we do sexy swash font C? Like, I don't know. But it's fine. Don't stress. Right? Charity reigns when it comes to the exams, things like this. This is me making sure that everything's kosher, at least with the delivery. Okay. Then we got, plenty of time to wrap up. So this was our segue into philosophy of language. Now back to our regularly scheduled programming, and let's wrap up the syntax for TFL. I'm going to define for you a sentence of TFL. Okay. As a run-up to defining it, we're going to define the notion of an expression of TFL. The core constituents of this language, basically there's three kinds of symbols. Capital letters, possibly with subscripts, that are our atoms. There are the 5 connectives that we talked about earlier today. And there are brackets. We've seen them already. I've mentioned them once or twice. The brackets basically help us chunk complex sentences. So we can say that an expression of TFL is any string of these. Or to use the fancy language, we can say it's any concatenation. Concatenation is just a term to say, yeah, ordering. Any ordering of these symbols is an expression. So yeah.
These have no restriction because nothing. So it doesn't have to make sense.
No. An expression is just basically any collection of these, right? It's a bit like if you take the 26 Roman letters, right? You can stick them together in whatever order you want and get an expression of English. But an expression does not mean yet give. Or to put it another way, only some expressions are actually going to be sentences. Yeah.
A string of one is one. Is a string of one also a string?
That's the limit case, right? So just a kind of like negation stuck on its own, that's an expression of TFL. So expressions are any collection of these in any order you want. But that's just basically like saying, cool, throw as many letters as you want together, throw as many English words in any order you want. It's not going to give you a sentence. So only some expressions will count as sentences. Individual atoms on their own will count as sentences. The clue is in the name. Remember, they're atomic sentences, so they're sentences. So a capital letter written by itself, cool. That is a TFL sentence and an expression. The second one is going to be further sentences formed out of atoms using the connectives in the appropriate way. And the next slide is going to tell you how to use the connectives in the appropriate way. Now brace yourselves. This is a terror. Right. So here is our definition of a sentence in TFL. Do not worry, I'm not going to ask you to write this on an exam, but it is worth us writing it out clearly. So this is a 7-clause definition for what a sentence in TFL is. Our first clause says every atomic sentence is a sentence. That's the beginning. Those are our one-by-one Lego that we build everything else from. Every other clause, clauses 2 through 6, note their structure. They are all conditionals. They say if you already have a sentence, then you can use the connectives in these ways to give you something that is also a sentence. So if you have a sentence, you can stick a negation in front of it, and you still have something grammatical. Or if you have two things that are sentences, you can stick a conjunction between them, slap some brackets on the outside, and you have a new sentence. And the same thing for disjunction, conditional, and a biconditional. But the big one, the most important one, is clause 7. If you don't abide by these rules, fuck off. Nothing else counts as a sentence. You have to conform to these. This is the one that blocks so many expressions from being sentences. It basically says you have to be strictly following these rules. If you do not abide by these rules, you do not meaningfully express anything in this language. You're more like strings of English letters than an actual English sentence. So one thing to note is that this is what we call a recursive definition. That is, it begins with a very specific base of units, elements, the atoms, and then details ways to generate infinitely many more elements. Take an atom, slap a negation in front. Take the sentence you just generated in your original atom, slap a conjunction between them. Take your original atom and that conjunction sentence you just built, slap a disjunction between them. Just keep going. You're generating sentences, meaningful expressions in this language. Notably, this definition also means you can always decompose. That is, whenever you're given an expression of TFL, you should be able to strip it apart bit by bit by bit and get down back to just the atoms that it started with. Yeah.
Is there a way to actually say something in TFL without it being a sentence, or is this how? Is there a way to break this in a way that what you have written down still makes sense instead of just a random collection of garbage?
No.
Okay.
Basically. This is why TFL is extremely restrictive. Right? That's effectively what Clause 7 is doing, right? So there'll be lots and lots and lots of expressions, right?
So sentence effectively means meaningful expression.
Yes. But of course, we do have to be careful. Meaningfulness for TFL really just means something that can be true or false. Right? This is something we're going to talk about in Lecture 3 next week. But remember, when we were talking about symbolization keys, I told you that it was just a kind of mapping between atomic sentences and English sentences. And we might loosely say that sort of giving the meaning of the atoms, that's not quite true. That's just a mapping. The meaning of an atomic sentence in TFL is just, is it on, is it off? It doesn't have any kind of meaning in the same way that we think of like, the ball is red has meaning. There's no reference in TFL. There's just true and there's false, and that's it. Okay, so again, this recursive definition, don't panic too much about it, but note the way it tells you how these sentence structures look. You're always going to have, if we're following the strict sentence construction rules, if you have a two-place connective, you have sentences on either side, and you have brackets on the outside. If you're following the strict rules, there's no brackets, it's not a sentence. Now, between friends, when we're doing the exam, I'm not going to be that mean, but it doesn't hurt to get in good habits early. Similarly, note, right, a negation, you always just stick it in the front. Yes?
In the book they use two types of brackets. When do we use which one?
Yes, good. So the book talks about the relaxed bracketing convention. We're going to talk about that in about 2 slides. This is importantly setting up the language strictly. Right? And of course, there's how the language strictly goes, and then there'll be how we actually use it in our day-to-day. So yeah, we're going to talk about that in just a second. Okay. So 3 slides. Sorry, I forgot what's next. So again, thinking about this kind of deconstruction. Here's a very silly sentence that we can show as a sentence by the deconstruction. So we have not Q. We can show this as a sentence by thinking about how it was built. We start off. We snap the outside negation off and look at, okay, with the 5 negations, is that a sentence? Well, that could only be a sentence if snap. The one with 4 is a sentence. Well, that could only work if the one with snap 3, snap 2, snap 1, until we get to the atom. That's the test. We're going to go for a slightly more complex one next, but that's the basic idea. You should always be able to effectively show how, in reverse, it started with an atom, and then use one of the clauses 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 to build the next step, all the way up until you hit the sentence you've been given. And if you can't do that, it's not a sentence, it's merely an expression. Yeah?
With that example, is, for example, the negation of A the same as A?
Yeah. So importantly, we're just thinking about the grammar here, right? We haven't really said anything about when sentences are going to be true, what they're going to be equivalent to, anything like that. Just thinking about grammar right now. And much like in English, English allows for, oh, it's not the case that I wouldn't do that if I were not going to, da 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 da. That's the kind of thing we're playing with here. Again, the thing to take away is just, all I'm doing right now is teaching you the syntax, teaching you the grammar. We're going to talk about the meaning of these expressions next week. Okay. Slightly more complex example, but this gets the same idea. Here is an expression of TFL. If we want to find out if it's a sentence, we work backwards. We see if we can figure out, by deconstructing it, how it was built. And we start off, in this case, by, hey, okay, the negation is the thing in the front, so let's snap it off. Well, this is going to be a sentence if that thing is. Okay, this is going to be a sentence if that part and that part are both sentences. And basically, we're snapping it at the highest level of connection every time. And we know that's a sentence because it's an atom. And clause 1 tells us every atom is a sentence. So cool. Already done with that part. And then we just keep going. Each step is us finding the highest point of connection, snapping it there, and then looking at the parts we have left. And we just keep breaking until we end up at the atoms. Yes?
Is there a formalized way of doing this?
Yeah. I mean, effectively, that's what this is. So what?
A formalized way of proving that this is indeed a sentence.
Yeah. In effect, that's what this is.
Okay, so you can just do the writing and then.
Yeah. And now again, let me stress why it's so important that we get this right. So the tool we're going to use for evaluation that's going to determine when TFL sentences, the complex ones, are true and false. It's going to work by flipping on and off atoms. So we're going to assign truth values to the atoms. And then truth is effectively going to flow upwards through the buildings all the way up to the final, most complex level. The truth of these is going to determine the truth value of the parts immediately higher, which will determine the truth value of the parts immediately higher, and so on until we've determined the truth value of the very top level. We have to make sure that it's in the right grammar, because if it's not, then the truth values can't flow upwards. The pipes will be blocked, as it were. This is why the grammar is so damn important. This is why we bang on for this for a really boring long time. We have to get it right. Because if we don't get it right, then the whole rest of it's just nonsense. None of it works anymore. Again, I know, hey, isn't philosophy fun? Don't stress. This is just kind of getting very clear. Okay. So, last few little bits here to wrap up. First thing to note, given the definition, it follows that every sentence of TFL must contain at least one atom. It's the thing you start with in order to build up the complex sentences. So no matter how complex a sentence of TFL is, it must have at least one atomic part. The other big notion here is the notion of a main logical operator. The main logical operator, effectively, is the last operator we built the sentence with. It's the highest level connective. Finding the main logical operator is a big and important thing, something we're going to work on in the tutorials. We'll talk about again next week. 2 tips for doing it. The easiest one is, if you're looking at a sentence and the very first thing you come across is a negation, and the sentence is written following the strict rules, a negation is your main operator. Because it's basically controlling everything that's inside. It's got the biggest scope. But if you don't have that, here's the trick. Start counting brackets. Every time you hit a left-hand bracket, put a finger up. Every time you hit a right-hand bracket, take a finger down. If the sentence is written following the strict rules, that is, if it has the outside brackets, the first operator you come across with only one finger up has to be the main operator. Take this one. What's the main operator of this sentence? It's the negation. What about this one?
Or
It's the or. How about this one? Our third one down. Sorry if people can see. It's the conjunction. And our last one? The negation. Again, something we'll kind of practice on, just rough and ready, way to get going. Now, why do we care about finding the main operator? Between friends, to preempt something we're going to talk about next week. It's the thing that we're going to care about to determine whether the sentence is true or false. Everything is going to flow up into it, and its truth value is what's going to tell us whether the sentence as a whole is true or false.
if you have, for example, noun A, do you always have to put some brackets?
No.
And then this still works.
Yeah, so the thing you have to be careful of is apart from the negation. That's why in this case, we ignore the negation. Okay. So, last two bits. Yes?
What would be the definition of main logical operator?
So the definition here is effectively the operator that has the biggest scope. So the main logical operator of a sentence is the operator that has the largest scope for the sentence. This tells us the last 2 points I want to make for today. The penultimate one is actually defining the notion of scope that we talked about earlier. Remember we talked about where we had the negation? Whether it was the whole sentence it was controlling or just part of a sentence? Well, we can define the notion of scope. The scope of a connective is the sub-sentence for which that connective is the main logical operator. So the MLO for a sentence is going to be the one whose scope is the whole sentence. It's the big bad one in the room. And finally, we can come back to your question about brackets. So, on the strict rules, we have to have brackets whenever we use these two-place connectives. I am not going to require that you do that because some people just get lost. I am going to require that you have brackets if and only if not having them would lead to grammatical confusion. Here's a way to make an example to drive that home. Take this. This is garbage. We cannot understand what this is saying. And the reason we cannot understand what this is saying is we don't know what connections are attached to what. What is this disjunction linking? It could be this conditional and this conjunction, or it could be this negation and this conditional, or it might be this negation and this negation. Without the brackets, we don't know. So all I care about is that you have to have brackets to avoid grammatical ambiguity. That is a no-no. Now, which type of brackets can you use? Go nuts. I don't care. You can use the curved brackets, you can use square brackets, you can use angle brackets. Perfectly fine. There is one small exception to that rule, though. Do not use the little curly brackets. The ones with the little little thing in the middle, the pinch, that means something very specific. We're going to talk about that in the second half of the course. But you can use, and Jesus, that's not a very good angle bracket. You can use angle brackets, you can use square brackets, you can use the regular ones, whatever is easier for you to help you read the sentences. I do not mind at all. Okay, so I know this was a lot. I know this was also not necessarily the most fun stuff in the world, but don't worry, this is all set up so we can actually have fun next time. So the topic for next time is basically, right now we're effectively all fluent in the grammar. But we haven't said when they're true or false. Fluent enough. So the thing for next time is we're going to talk about the machinery to decide when they're true and false. This is what we're going to talk about in lecture 3. Thanks for coming, guys. Take care. We'll see you all Friday.